Hello and welcome. Thank you for attending GITA's annual Bridge Speaker event. We are very excited to be hosting this event back on campus. My name is Lexi Allen, and I will be your MC for today. Before we begin today's program, we would like to take a moment to honor and name the land we stand on today. MSU Denver honors and acknowledges that we are on traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. This area was the site of trade, hunting, gathering, and healing for many other native nations: the Lakota, Ute, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, and others. We recognize that indigenous peoples, sorry y'all. We recognize that indigenous peoples are as the original stewards of this land, water, plants, and animals, and call this place home. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties of these nations have their traditional homelands and renewed and reaffirmed. Let us also acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal of this territory. We respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. We pay our respect to them and give thanks to all the tribal nations and ancestors of this place. We also want to recognize the community and families of Aurora displaced by the creation of this campus for MSU Denver to have a place we now call home. Additionally, we would like to take this opportunity to thank this year's co-sponsors for this event: the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the Center for Equity and in Student Achievement, the LGBTQ Student Resource Center, and the Center for Multicultural Engagement and Inclusion, the Departments of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, Africana Studies, Chicano and Chicano Studies, Political Science, Social Work, and the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. Thank you, David Sherman, for the tech support, and to the Professional Sign Language Interpreting Inc. for your ASL services today. Also, a very special thank you and shout out to the LGBTQ Student Resource Center and Department of Political Science for their sponsorship of 50 copies of Patrisse's new book, an Abolitionist Handbook, 12 Steps to Changing Yourself and the World for students on campus. GITA is grateful for you all and for our co-sponsors in an effort to bring this program to campus as we continue celebrating Black History Month. Lastly, please take a moment after today's program to fill a quick 2-question eval for today's program. The QR code is around you on your seats and in the foyer. And now for today's event. We are gathered here today to celebrate the long-standing annual Bridge Speaker, which serves as a bridge between Black History Month in February and Women's History Month in March. A role that honors our ability to transform the modes of care and not punishment. We are delighted to introduce to you Patrisse Cullors, New York Times best-selling author whose Twitter hashtag launched the Black Lives Matter movement. Today, Black Lives Matter is the banner of this generation's civil rights movement and a call to activism nationwide. It is now a global foundation supporting Black-led movements in the US, UK, and Canada, and a 2021 Nobel Peace Prize nominee. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, When They Call You a Terrorist, and the soon-to-be released 12 Steps to Changing Yourself and the World, an Abolitionist Handbook, which will be published January 2022. She is an educator, artist, and abolitionist, and one of the most influential social activists of the world today. Welcome, Patrisse Cullors, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, team. How are we? Okay, oh, yay. I just want to remind people we're not on Zoom. For the people who are in the building, I know other folks are watching on a live stream, but for who's in the building, you can clap, you can snap, you can ashe, you can amen. You don't have to mute your microphone. We should be celebrating. Because every single one of you made it, and that's so important. I want to start this conversation off with just grounding us in the fact that we've been living inside a global pandemic for 2.5 years, going on the third year. I want to honor everyone who may have lost a loved one during this time, who've experienced great loss and grief during this time. And I want to really give a huge shout out to all of our frontline workers who have been taking care of us through this pandemic. So I wanted to just take a moment to do that. I also want to share how important it is that we are living in a moment where there is a very public conversation about abolition. There's a very public conversation about what does it actually mean to build a world that is centered around human care and human dignity. That we're living in a moment where 20 million people took to the streets in 2020 during a pandemic to say enough is enough. We're living in a moment where we are challenging local structures, state structures, national structures, and global structures, and their relationships to human beings. A lot of folks often are scared of the term abolition. They don't fully understand what it means in this moment, and what its history and legacy is. So I want to take some time to define what it means to be an abolitionist, what it means for all of us to show up in this moment to change the very structure of this country. So, most of us know that folks in this country had enslaved Africans as chattel, and they used those human beings as a way to build wealth. And then there was a movement to abolish chattel slavery, and inside of that movement, there was a movement to ensure that people's dignity, Black people's dignity in particular, was held true. And then folks won. They won the ending of chattel slavery. But we didn't fully abolish the system. And instead of creating a brand new system focused on abolition, we recreated a system. Many of us know it as the prison industrial complex. And inside of that system, we've witnessed human beings be caged at the millions, most of which are Black and brown. And inside of that system, we've seen the war on drugs, we've seen Jim Crow, we've seen Black codes, we've seen the war on gangs. I grew up in a community and a neighborhood where my whole family, all of my community was decimated by policing and incarceration. And I knew it in my gut, even as a small child, that this wasn't the answer. That policing in my community wasn't the answer, and incarcerating my brother and my siblings and my father and my cousins was not the answer. But I didn't know what the answer was until I went to a critical resistance workshop when I was 18 years old, and I heard the term prison industrial complex. And then I learned that we had created an entire system that benefited from caging human beings. And I remember sitting in my seat thinking, there has to be another way. There has to be another way. And that's when I would learn about the term modern day abolitionist and the role that we could play. And that was almost 16 years ago. Before the term abolition was popular, we were sitting in small rooms maybe 10 people at a time, fringy. No one was thinking about abolition, no one was really talking about abolition, except for people and groups like Critical Resistance. Many of you may know some of the co-founders of Critical Resistance, Angela Davis, Ruthie Gilmore. These Black women who said there has to be another way for our society. And in fact, the way that we are moving forward is only going to continue to create danger for communities. And so when I was 19 years old, I dedicated my life to being an abolitionist. And I decided that whatever I do, it's going to do two things. One, it's going to take down the system that's been impacting my family, and then two, build a vision towards a new system. I love this snap in the front, thank you. I was in San Diego yesterday and there was another snapper in the front and I was like, thank you. And so a couple years after that workshop, I and many others across Los Angeles County were informed that our county government was going to push forward on building 2 new jails. And those jails were gonna cost, at minimum, $3.5 billion. Did y'all hear that? They're going to cost $3.5 billion. And so we challenged that concept. And many of us, at first it was a small group of us, maybe 20 folks, showed up to our local government and said, no, we do not want new jails. We actually want those monies invested into other places. And they laughed at us. They said, you all don't know what you're talking about, this abolition thing you're saying, it's crazy. We're gonna keep moving forward. This is about public safety. How many times have we heard that? Right? And so we kept fighting, and year after year, we petitioned. Year after year, we protested. Year after year, we showed up to every single meeting where the agenda was about building a new jail. And we brought more people. And we organized Los Angeles, and we brought more people. And we organized Los Angeles, and we brought more people. And year after year, the same county board of supervisors told us, you're being crazy. You do not know and understand public safety. The community wants more jails. The community wants more sheriffs. And in 2017, hundreds of us decided, you know what? We need to build a broader coalition. Because we understood that if LA moved forward on this jail plan, it would set the precedent for people across the country, for elected officials across the country to say, yes, LA did it, so should we. So we created one of the most powerful, in my life, protest art actions, where we built 100 jail beds. And we placed them in the middle of the street in August of 2017. And we organized 50 organizations, not just in LA County, but across the country to stand with us, to rise with us, to interrupt this jail plan. And at the same time, many of those elected officials who were saying no to us were termed out. And as the new set of elected officials were coming on board, we organized them. We said, what are you going to do? Are you going to stop this train from moving when you get into office? We threatened their seats. We threatened their jobs. Because we understood if we challenged this jail, if we made sure it wasn't built, then we ensured a bright future for our children and their children's children. And so 100 jail beds in the streets, 500 people in the streets. We went and marched, we shouted, we spoke out, and in 2018, The women's jail, which was one of the jails they were going to build, was stopped. And it was a victory, and we were excited, and we celebrated, but we had one more jail to stop. And that was the mental health jail. Yes, I said it. A mental health jail. They had a contract with McCarthy, a big construction agency. We went after the McCarthy Foundation, we went after the McCarthy contractors, and we started a campaign called Cancel the Contract. And we met with supervisors, and we met with the people, and in 2019, we stopped the mental health jail from being built. We didn't just stop it from being built, we canceled an active contract between the County Board of Supervisors and a contractor, which was unprecedented, and now we set a precedent. And so this conversation about abolition, while we have led the campaign at the local level in Los Angeles to upend jail construction, there's another conversation that I want to talk about this morning. And that's the conversation around how abolition positions a new vision for this country, and I argue for the world. Abolition is about getting rid of systems, but it's also about how we show up and how we treat each other. Abolition is about building institutions of care and dignity. It's about challenging the institutions that say they're about care and dignity and pushing them to be about care and dignity. Abolition is about how we treat each other in our movements, about how we show up for each other as a team. And abolition is about centering humanity. In the first chapter of my book, I talk about what leads an abolitionist movement and how, in our interpersonal relationships, we have to fight harder. Courageous conversations is at the foundation of abolition. Whether that's the courageous conversation you have to have with your loved ones or the courageous conversation you have to have with your local government. It's through our courage that changes systems. Another chapter in my book is Nothing is Fixed. There is an opportunity to change everything. As I just discussed the campaign to end jail expansion in Los Angeles County, those elected officials told us to stop coming back. They said, do not fight this fight, you've already lost. But nothing is fixed, and guess what? Organizing works. And for me, in the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years to build a new vision, imagination has to be at the center of that. Another chapter of my book, I talk about the importance of imagination. The reality is we live in a system, in a white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist system that is invested in making us believe that the way this system works has always been this way. They make us believe when we say no more jails, no more prisons, no more police, the first question is questioning that idea. And so we have to choose our imagination over the imagination that they forced on us. We have to choose to imagine a different world. We have to choose to imagine a different system, a different way of relating to each other. Nobody else is going to change the system unless we do, unless we show up for it. And so our work as abolitionists is to have courage, is to build, is to be imaginative, is to show up even when it's no longer trendy to show up. In 2020, 20 million people took to the streets. And they didn't just take to the streets, they changed our government. In 2021, we witnessed a great backlash against the movement and an undermining against the movement. And this current government that we have in place has said over and over again, we do not support the defund movement. That doesn't mean we stop the movement. That doesn't mean that we don't follow suit on the commitment to continue to value Black lives. This work as abolitionists isn't just about having people survive. This work as abolitionists is about calling for us to thrive. And as we celebrate this Black History Month, many of us call it Black Futures Month, I would like every single one of you to recommit. If you're on the fence about being an abolitionist, that's okay. Read some books. If you're on the fence about what we need to imagine, that's okay. Talk to the people in your family and community. If you're trying to figure out your way inside of this movement, that's okay. There is space for every single one of us. What we know, especially in these last 2.5 years, living under a pandemic, is this current system does not work. And so we don't have much to lose because we have lost so much already. It is worth imagining something new. It is worth imagining abolition. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you. That was really powerful. And I'm really honored to be in your presence. This is so exciting. So we have some questions here. So to start, I'm curious on what your thoughts are around the Black Lives Matter movement kind of shifting to becoming a little more performative and a little more centered around whiteness. I'm curious on what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with that. So I think that's my first thought. I think it's important that when we talk about movements, we understand that there's multiple aspects of movements. So the larger movement for Black Lives is a movement that didn't just start 8 years ago. We've been fighting for Black liberation since the moment that Black folks touched the shores of this country. And that fight for Black liberation has looked different across the country and across the world. And I think that as you work with people on the ground who have continued the work, there has been no performatism. But I think that the question around when there became a big opening in 2020, the question around whiteness performing support and solidarity, I think that's the actual question. And so the problem with giving while guilty is that guilt is a fleeting emotion. And so when we ask and call for allyship, when we ask and call for accomplishment, we ask that it's given not from a place of guilt, but from a place of groundedness, a place of understanding when Black people get free, everybody else gets more free. And so I would never say that the movement is being performative. In fact, the movement has been the movement for hundreds of years. But I would say that whiteness becomes performative. And I'm not quick to judge. I don't want to lead with judgment, because judgment doesn't actually get us anywhere either, as guilt doesn't get us anywhere. But I want to lead with a challenge and a push and courage. This system that we live in When our communities are under attack, when our communities are in utter despair, it's all of our obligation to change that. And so there was a moment in 2020 where lots of white corporations and white people, I got a ton of texts from white friends being like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, what? I got like random Venmo money. I was like, this is very strange. It's a strange relationship to your guilt. But that, sure, thank you for the apology and thank you for the money. But what we actually need is people to show up even when it's hard. We need people to show up even when the right wing rears its head and starts to seed sows of doubt and disinformation and misinformation and lies. That's actually when we need you the most. So that's the call and the challenge.
I appreciate that. And as I reflect on what it means to be an ally and what it means to be an activist, I always think about who isn't at the table. And if you are at the table, to me, being an ally and activist means either stepping away so someone can be at the table or pulling up a chair. So I really appreciate you touching on that. In your opinion, why is intersectionality critical to this movement?
Sure, and if anybody out there can get me a tissue, I'm really not used to this cold. My body is like freaking out. That would be great, thank you so much. Sure, I think, what's really important, thank you. Trying. Allyship. Thank you. I don't know how y'all do it out here. Okay, so intersectionality. This term, I'm so grateful, Kimberly Crenshaw, the person who coined the term intersectionality, thank goodness for her. And also, I think this term has been in some ways overused and a bit abused. People use it in ways, sometimes I'm like, that's not how you use that word. But I'll say that the reason why Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term is because she saw that the ways in which people were showing up around race and gender were very one-dimensional. It was really a challenge to white feminism, and it was also a challenge to the idea that blackness is only in relationship to maleness. And if you are all things, woman, queer, black, then that means that both the system treats you as such, and you also are related to as such. So we have to meet the needs of a whole human being, the totality of that human being, and the ways that the different intersections of their oppression. When we deny that, that means that we are actually not getting to the root of what is needed for a community and a people. So intersectionality becomes really important, not just as an identity, but it becomes important to how we change the material conditions for communities. So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know once I heard what intersectionality was, it kind of like changed my life, because I wasn't sure, like, what is it when you experience racism, but sexism at the same time? So learning about that was really powerful for me. And it's unfortunate it took me so long, but it's important to address, so thank you. For folks who might be unsure of nervous about the how-to journey towards abolition, what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, well, it is a journey. Being an abolitionist is a journey. It's still a journey for me, and I'm a staunch abolitionist. And in the most recent years, especially as we've seen more convictions of police, more convictions of vigilantes, questions have come, like, well, what do we do with police who kill our communities? What do we do with vigilantes? If this is the only system that currently is in place, is that true and real accountability? I don't have answers. I have more questions. And I think that is the journey of being an abolitionist, not the person who has all the answers, not the person who is the most correct or the most woke in a room. In fact, I would argue that most abolitionists are trying to figure out, how do you practice abolition in a context that is anti-abolition? How do you do that? How do you practice abolition when all of our institutions are deeply embedded in capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy? How is it possible? Part of the reason why I wrote the book was to say, yes, we have to think big and we have to think grand, and also we could practice abolition in our relationships. We could practice abolition in our community, in our friendships. We can practice abolition at the local level, and that is how we organize, you know? In my early days of organizing, when I was 18 years old, I remember, you know, the first organizing volunteer work I did was talking to people on the bus. I met with people on the bus. The organization I was with had sued the Metropolitan Transit Agency on transit racism. Its claim was that Black and brown people in Los Angeles were not receiving enough public dollars towards the transit system, creating an unequal system. And it was true. I was a bus rider. I felt that experience. And imagine going on a bus and trying to tell people to join an organization to fight transit racism, and they're like, no, I need to get to my job, stop talking to me, right? But eventually, we would win more and more, and more and more people would join, and at the height of that organization, a small civil rights organization, when the MTA was going to raise the bus fare, we organized 2,000 people to show up to the MTA board meeting. They'd never seen that before. So much so that not all 2,000 people could fit in the chambers. And so that we were out in the lobby and we were out on the streets. That's what organizing looks like. It's always small. 20 million people don't come to the streets because one day 20 million people are like, oh, we gotta fight for Black lives. 20 million people hit the streets because many of us are organizing on the day-to-day. We're building on the day-to-day. And so that's the work of abolition. The work of abolition is to start small. Start at home. Start in your own community and build towards that. And I promise you, in that building, in that organizing, things shift because they have to.
Thank you. That kind of just made me think of another question. You mentioned starting with your relationship. So how does that look like? How do you be an abolitionist to your friends, to your family? How do you have those conversations?
You know, I started the book off with the first chapter being courageous conversations. And there's a set of questions at the end of that chapter that's like, hey, do you think you're ready to have this conversation? We're not always ready to start our journey, and it's actually really important to understand that. What will make you ready? It's like starting a marathon. You don't just like wake up and do a marathon. You're like, what's gonna get me there? What's gonna build that muscle? For me, building that muscle has been, I'm actually in conflict with a friend right now. I will not use names. And it's not fun. I hate being in conflict with my friends. It's like the worst feeling ever. And, you know, we had a text exchange, an email exchange, and then I was like, you know what, let's actually get off of our technology and talk. And, you know, that is actually really important note for a new generation where like texting and social media become the place where the grounds of conflict often happen. But I promise you those are not the place in which resolution happens. Resolution happens when you can meet with the people that you love. And I'm not saying do this in places where you may be in danger, no. When you read the chapter Courageous Conversations, it's really about the people you're in community with. Those are often the first people that we're willing to cut out of our lives, willing to cut out. But I really argue that, you know, how we are in relationship to each other builds the world that we eventually want to live in. If we were to get rid of jails and prisons and courts today, we would just recreate them based off of how we treat each other. We would create a new version of that. If anyone has seen, over and over again, the role of the social media mob, a mob that often turns into the police, the judge, the jury, without actually knowing the true conflict and what's happening. And so our job is to slow ourselves down, think about our values. I always lead with my values. What do I believe in? If I do this action, is this gonna line up with my values? And if it's not, what's an action that will?
Thank you, thank you. On your website, it mentions that your vision is of a world that honors our ability to transform through modes of care and not punishment. Can you share more of an example of when you've seen this happen?
Yeah, I believe that the economy that we are currently all activated inside of is an economy of punishment. And I would say that neglect is one of the highest forms of punishment. So when you neglect an entire community, an entire neighborhood, when you leave people to die, to suffer, that's punishment. I think a lot about the Hurricane Katrina and all of the horrific stories that came out of Hurricane Katrina, but one of them is seared in my mind, which is the prisoners that were at the county jail that were left in the jail by themselves. The guards left, the staff left, and they were left to drown and die. That's punishment, that's neglect. The work that we are doing is trying to create systems that actually are invested in an economy of care, an economy that is deeply rooted in the care of human beings and all living beings. I think the work that we've done at the local level in Los Angeles is a great example of that. So the other part of the story is when we got rid of the jails, we also erected a new working group called the Alternatives to Incarceration Working Group, in which hundreds of people across LA County sat together, met one another, and have been working on figuring out what does Los Angeles County need so that it is care first. It's literally called care first, jail last. And so that is how we've done it on the systems level.
Thank you. That reminds me of restorative justice and looking at how can we, instead of looking at punitive, you did this bad action, so let's violence on violence, let's look at how we can heal. Yeah, so I really like that perspective, and I think it can be hard for people to kind of look at what does life look like without jails? What does life look like without harsh punishment? And I think I really like how you touch on the humanity and acknowledging that we're all humans, and if we care for each other a little more and if we love each other a little more, then maybe like that in itself is like a form of activism.
Also, I didn't make that up. That really does come from Audre Lorde and her and her teachings around care and healing and like revolutionary acts of care. There's a long lineage that really has been led by Black women around how we take care of each other. And so I'm really just building off of that lineage.
Yeah. I always think of when Audre Lorde said self-care is a form of resistance in a society that doesn't want you to care for yourself. So thank you. So we're going to go ahead and transition to the audience question session. We have some online folks, and then as well as people in person. So I guess, should we start with the in-person first? Okay, yeah. So Soj is gonna run the microphone to y'all if you have any questions to start.
Nice to meet you. I'm Michael Diaz-Rivera, and I so appreciate your work. I really like you're making me think about organizing. In Denver, Colorado is super splintered and super white, where the Black people oftentimes find themselves fighting against each other, brown folks versus Black, all of that type of thing. where do you see us in the future organizing ourselves so that we can unite rather than divide?
It's a great question. And I think it's really important. So there's two things here. One is when folks decide that it's really important for them to organize within their own, racial groups or gender groups. I always like to respect that. Obviously, I helped create a movement called Black Lives Matter, in which we've centered Blackness and Black people. And I will also say the second part of that is the only way in this country that we're going to be able to upend big systems is if we work in coalition. How we work in coalition is critical, though. And so who becomes the driving force? So I always ground my work in Los Angeles County, even though I helped be a part of building a global movement. My work, the work that I feel most tied to is the work that I've done locally, because I believe that what we do at the local level transforms the national and global level. And so at the local level, we centered people who'd been directly impacted by incarceration. The people who've both been incarcerated and the loved ones who supported folks incarcerated. So they're the ones who led that fight, their strategy, their understanding, and then people allied with us and built a broad coalition to make sure that our vision towards what abolition looks like was at the center. And this was not easy. It took a lot of conversations. In fact, big institutions that we, had to align with because we were small, would often, in our sort of like separate conversations, not in front of elected officials, they'd be like, we have to say that, we can't just say no jails. We have to say a smaller jail. And we would always say to them, you don't get to lead this fight. This is not your story. Have you been in that jail? Have you been in jail? Has your loved one been in jail? You don't understand the devastation, so you don't get to decide what the solution is. And they listened, not all the time, and it took courageous conversations and coming back to it. But part of the work of upending systems and building new systems means it's going to take a lot of us, and it's going to take us to do it inside of coalition.
Hi, my name, can you hear me?
Kinda, yeah, it would be.
All right. My name is Michael Diaz-Beltran, a student here at MSU Denver. I want to talk about on the concept of the narrative of defund the police. Yeah. I think you'll have there are some people that have said they support the movement, and there are also some people that have opposed. And my two questions are, what would you say to people that oppose defund the police? And in your opinion, what do you think is the best approach in order to create some form of change within that system?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's important to note that the defund movement didn't start in 2020. It actually started, some people, lots of people say they're the origins of it. Some folks in LA say they started it. Some folks in Oakland say they started it. I think it was just hive mind, and a bunch of us were talking about it at the same time. But the heart of the conversation around defund is truly about where resources go. So I'm gonna take a little bit of time to answer this question because it's a really important question. One, it's very, very important, and I think what was beautiful about 2020 outside of the uprisings is that a lot of people were starting to look at their local budgets. They started looking at their city council budget. They started looking at their county board of super budget. They started looking at state budgets, and they started looking at national budgets, and they were like, wait a second. Okay, in my city, so I'm gonna talk about Los Angeles. Los Angeles City, 50% of the city budget goes to the police. And yet, we have one of the largest houseless crises, one of the largest unemployment crises. And the policing, we're not policing our way out of that crisis. So the question became, well, if budgets are a part of how we view our communities and our people, then we have to reallocate that budget. So the biggest piece of defund is about reallocation. It's a conversation about how do we actually treat the needs of the community? So if we have a houseless crisis, why do we pour more and more dollars into police force instead of pouring dollars into actually dealing with houselessness? One simple solution is getting people into homes and houses. It's not that easy, but that is an actual fight that should be happening, and it is happening at the local level. Another solution is, how do we get people access to jobs and employment? How do we get people access to green space and healthy food? The question really is a question for our elected officials. What are you willing to do? One of the biggest fights in the last few years have been, okay, let's really look at what police do. What is their actual jobs and roles? And we started to realize that police were given, their role was outsourced. They were given roles like being social workers, being mental health crisis responders. Well, those are places where you could cut the budget. You could put that money into actual mental health services, into actual social workers. So this conversation about defund became deeply politicized when it's actually not a political conversation at all. The conversation about defund is a conversation about where human resources need to be going. And I think that, this country is really good, both parties are really good at politicizing things, and it's deeply unfortunate because the only people who suffer are the people who are Black, brown, and poor.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Antoine, but I go by X. And I wanted to say thank you for being here. Your presence is liberating. So I'm gonna tell a little story, because I think it's gonna help to preface my question. So here at Auraria, we have campus police, and there are ongoing conversations among students. Some are pro-police, some are anti-police. To my knowledge, the Auraria Campus Police Department has around a $4.1 million budget. Our Auraria executives, which are made up of our college presidents, as well as the president of the Auraria Higher Education Center, are moving forward with a plan to put in place a public safety center. The students are saying, call it what it is, a new police station. And so my question as someone who is a student elected official, what do I do? Holding space for both groups of people, students who are pro-police, students who are anti-police, and how do we make change happen on this campus with 55,000 students between the three institutions? How do we make sure our voice gets heard when these executives are making decisions? One executive in particular, she said, this isn't a democracy, when we were having a conversation on policing and the validation of having body-worn cameras as a measure of progressive policing, even though there's data that suggests that body-worn cameras is not always effective in eliminating violence. So how do we, and how do I, within my salient identities, within my role, within the budgets, within the decision-making, how do we make change happen here? To Mr. Michael's point, it's very disjointed here. We're a commuter campus, and so I guess I'm looking for the secret sauce or the magic to make it happen.
No secret sauce or magic. Sorry, I'm gonna lead with that. I think what's important, and you said two words that have been really bastardized, and that's called public safety. We have to have a come to Jesus moment about what we say when we say public safety, and who gets to decide what public safety is, and who gets to decide who is enacting public safety. If you talk to Black people, if you go to Black people's houses, you knock on doors, which I've done, if you poll Black people and you said, do the police make you feel safer? They will say no. So that's not public safety if the entire public doesn't feel safe. that's, I'm probably like just getting like, starting to be an old grumpy organizer, but I'm just like, you guys, like, let's do it, let's do it different this time. I think what we start with is asking people, what does being safe look like to you? What would you need to feel safe? I am a big encourager of asking folks to interrogate how they understand what safety is, what they understand safety is. That feels really important for my own organizing purposes and conversations. It took us 15 years to stop the jails from happening. And in the conversations that we had leading up to stopping those jails, those were the first conversations we had. Let's get the public together. Let's talk about public safety. What are you scared of? What do you need? What are the resources you want? What you'll start to realize, especially for folks who say that they want public safety and believe that that's in policing, is that's a those are deep places of racism. And so we have to confront racism. We have to confront the ways in which racism impacts our ability to see public safety. And that takes time. That's why there's no magic sauce, because it takes time to change people's minds, change people's hearts, and they're not always going to. But the question becomes, what's important? Is it important for everybody to feel safe? Is it important for one group to feel safe? How do we create safety? Are there metrics around that? Like, do the police really make us safe? As we realized during the 2020 uprisings and in the time, the year and a half post it, so much of the metrics is like, actually, there's a lot of harm happening and the police don't stop it. And this is not an affront to police. I actually have a lot of family members who are police. We have a lot of conversations, like policing, the role of a police officer is, historically a working class, middle class job. So I'm not actually challenging the job, I'm challenging the system. I'm not challenging the human being with the badge on, I'm challenging the system in which they've inherited. And it takes critical conversations, it takes critical engagement to have a new conversation about what we all need.
Hi, I'm Sage. I'm a student at CCD. I am working on an Associate of Science in Chemistry, and I'm a fan of your work. Have been for a long time. I do have one question that I, as someone who has been a victim of violence, would like an answer to if there is one. What do we do about people who are progenitors of violence, who do not possess the empathy needed to be functional members of society, people who actively go out of their way to harm people for the sake of harming people? In a system where the police are demilitarized, defunded, and where better social safety nets are in place for people who are more likely to face violence. I lived in a house with a person who suffered a form of alcoholism that resulted in delusions. And it led to this person becoming incredibly violent, physically attacking me, physically attacking my roommates. It was my first encounter where I actually did have to attempt to rely on the police, and they did not do a thing. Even when this woman had stood at the top of the stairs while I was escaping this house with my very few possessions, she attempted to push me down the stairs in front of the police officers who we had just called to help save us from her. And they did nothing. They pulled her back, but she was not charged, she was not pressed, even though that they had seen an attempted murder right in front of their eyes. What do we do about people who are inherently violent?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say, I want to say sorry that happened to you. It's deeply traumatic. And I have also lived in a home with folks who have severe mental illness and it's been very scary. And, recognizing, at least in my experience, that I actually couldn't call the police. And so this is a question that I've been inside of. I opened, this conversation up with, there's a lot of questions I have. Part of the devastation of living in a police state is that every other social service has been divested from, has been defunded. And so in a crisis in which you do need true help, and also the person needs true help, we don't actually have that current system. It's why I do the work that I do. And I think part of our job, until we get there, right? Because the question is like, these things happen every day. What do we do? In the meantime, there are so many examples of groups and collectives across the country that are organizing communities to help support in times of crisis. There are groups of people that are developing an alternative to 911. And so a mental health practitioner comes out instead of the police, and that mental health practitioner knows what to do. I don't know if that exists in this city, in this town, but I do think that is a goal here, is to figure out, I would say number one, how do we rebuild the social safety net so that people are getting what they deserve and people are getting the care that they deserve? Two, what kind of crisis interventions can we develop and create that doesn't rely on police? And for the police that I've talked to, a lot of them have said, this is not what I was trained to do. I wasn't trained to be a mental health crisis practitioner. And so yeah, many of them come out and they do nothing. I had a situation with a loved one of mine who was in a severe mental health crisis, and we called the ambulance, and the ambulance came and they said they could do nothing. And then, we called the ambulance. They didn't show up for 48 hours because of defunding of the crisis interventions. But in 20 minutes, the police showed up. And in that 20 minutes, they handcuffed him, super traumatic. And then they said they couldn't find a gun on him, so they left. And so this person for 48 hours was left deteriorating in a mental health episode and didn't get what they needed until 48 hours later. All that to say is the work that we need to do is to create these systems of care. We have to create these systems of care, and in the meantime, it's not on you to do this, but I know for me, we've created a team in my own community where, if there is a mental health crisis that happens in our community, our neighborhood, we call each other. And especially for folks who have, a history with mental health, history with severe mental health issues, what I like to often do is to give that person agency, is to say, hey, let's have a really open conversation about our health status and what you may need. Is there a parent we can call if something happens? Is there a community member we can call? And so there's a lot of different ways to have this conversation. This is not the exhaustive answer for you, but what you're bringing up is a question that I've received many a times, and it's a question that I've had to ask myself because I've been in that situation before. Thank you.
We have a question from our online viewers.
Yes.
One of the most radical praxis concepts that I took from Abolitionist's handbook was about the Council of Community-Based Elders. This brings home for me what is meant by rejecting the idea that there is no alternative, and daring to imagine and create different ways of living with one another. I was wondering if you could talk more about your thinking about this, how you came to this. Thank you so much for your talk and your work.
Thank you. I heard you. I'm having a hard time hearing folks with their mask on, but I'm working on it. Okay, so this question slash response has come up a bunch from people who've read the book. When I visited Australia in 2016, when the organization Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation was offered the Sydney Peace Prize, I met with Indigenous folks, and one of the biggest conversations we had was the conversation about incarceration and how high, many folks inside the Indigenous community are being incarcerated over white folks in Australia. and that the system of incarceration from the US was exported there, and that there was a big resistance to upending that system and bringing back old systems like this Council of Elders. And so there was an example in one of the communities I was in where they had started like a blended system where it was like, you know, the kind of like criminal legal system and then like the OG Council of Elders, and that the Council of Elders were actually the first line of defense, and that it was them first who would, you know, sit down with the young person and you know, have a conversation about what they did, and if there's a place of repair to repair that harm. And it was very moving for me. I thought a lot about what it would have meant if in my neighborhood there was a council of elders that we could trust, and there were people that, you know, we could have went to for my sibling and my siblings' friends to have a conversation about, you know, what they were doing as children and like how to develop into healthy adults and human beings. And so I think that there's a way in which there's so much richness and wisdom inside of us and inside of our communities, and taking the time to organize ourselves, our people and our communities in that. It may feel very challenging at first, but there's so much reward on the other side of it.
All right. I think we can go ahead and start wrapping up. I think we should give Patrisse another round of applause for her presence.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.